Hello, my name's Rick and I'm a filmmaker living here in Bath. I've just made a film called Wild Swimmers, and it's a vampire thriller set on the River Avon. It follows a journalism student called Digi as she investigates a series of killings, thinking that she's on the trail of a serial killer. The further down the river Digi goes, the more profound she finds it. She likes the isolation, she likes being away from people. And in the course of Digi's research into the river, she reads a copy of Wind in the Willows. She pauses on the famous chapter Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The chapter and the artwork by E.H Shepherd seem to suggest that there is a mystical presence on the river. The author of Wind in the Willows, Kenneth Grahame, was a Scotsman. He first wrote about Pan in a paper called The Rural Pan in 1894. In the hushed recesses of Hurley Backwater, where the canoe may be paddled almost under the tumbling coombe of the weir, he wrote, he is to be looked for. There the god pipes with freest abandonment. Grahame, however, was not famous for his mysticism. He originally wrote Wind in the Willows as a satire on English society intended for adults.
But the thing was, because he chose to, to use animals and little toad and mole and rat, for some reason, that was assumed to be children's stuff. I mean, nobody thought that about Animal Farm, but so he was writing sort of myth as well. And the result was that people adopted it as a children's book.
The ancient god Pan plays a key role in chapter 7, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. What the chapter is about the disappearance of a small otter called Portly. And Ratty and Mole basically join the search party to go out on the river and look for him. While they're there though, they experience some strange hypnotic music, and it kind of lures them to an island on the river where they have a spiritual encounter with the Greek god Pan.
If we think about a river really is a kind of liminal space. And we hear that word liminal, and it really comes from the Latin word for threshold. It's a place between, and a river is very literally between places. We have the bank on one side and the bank on the other. And the encounter with the Piper takes place not just on the river, but on an island in the middle of the river. So it's kind of extra liminal.
It's a fascinating chapter, with Rat and Mole clearly having some kind of spiritual epiphany. The question of whether or not Grahame himself had a spiritual belief in Pan, however, is less clear-cut.
He wasn't a kind of capital P pagan the way people might be today, but he is clearly celebrating a kind of nature mysticism, a kind of natural mysticism that's really different from, formal church Christianity or anything like that. There's such a vividness to the experience of the water rat and mole. It's tempting to think that Grahame must have had some similar experience in nature, whether it was such a literal encounter with Pan, I don't know, but that sense of awe and wonder and reverence is so vivid in that chapter. Pan embodies the wilderness. He offers a way to kind of envision the spirit of the wild and to think about our relationship to the wild in a way that partly personifies it. Thinks about the wild as something alive and potentially dangerous too. Pan is not entirely safe.
Indeed, this experience is not particularly fun for the animals. Ratty and Mole are described as overwhelmed and fearful around the great god Pan, although he's also described as loving and even holy. These kind of feelings around the great god Pan date back to the earliest descriptions of him in literature.
It's possible that Pan's career as a god really began with that primal feeling of fear, fear in the wilderness, fear of the unknown and of the power of nature.
There are other explanations for the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. With its description of Pan as having rippling muscles and being curvaceous, one theory is that the chapter is written as an expression of Grahame's sexuality.
You get to this description of Pan, which is quite something out of the ordinary in the book, because it's very sensual, it's very homoerotic, and he indulges that for nearly a page, really. which makes you wonder, why did Grahame take this chapter of all the chapters so seriously?
Pan himself in the ancient world was a kind of sexually ambiguous god. He would pursue male shepherds, he would pursue nymphs sort of equally. And there's a way in which Pan could be brought into stories and art and literature in ways that imply alternative kinds of sexuality without being too explicit about it. And there are questions about Kenneth Grahame's kind of relationships with men and his own sense of identity.
Another explanation for The Piper at the Gates of Dawn is that Grahame was merely satirising the popular trends of his time. The motoring story, the boating story. One theory is that the chapter is a satire of the mystical fantasy. Whatever the reasons for the inclusion of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, its presence in The Wind and the Willows would prove controversial. And after Grahame died, several publishers would remove the chapter altogether. But was this proof that the establishment was trying to suppress the great god Pan?
After he died, lots of editions came out which were shortened, and what the chapters that were dropped out were the non-Toad chapters generally. Piper's is so obviously not about children or not about childhood in any possible way that it was quite obvious that was the reason. It was just simply didn't fit in with the idea of what the book was now to be.
Without Piper at the Gates of Dawn, it's a book about talking animals, having adventures. When you bring in Piper at the Gates of Dawn, it adds this very explicitly pagan, mystical, weird dimension to the book that could potentially offend conservative religious sensibilities. So I suspect that has played a role in some publishers' decisions not to include the chapter.
Whether it was removed for conservative reasons or not, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn would go on to be hugely inspirational among the 1960s rock generation, including Van Morrison and most famously Pink Floyd.
Floyd's debut album was named after the chapter and allegedly inspired by a vision of Pan by songwriter Syd Barrett.
Pink Floyd's manager talks about how Syd Barrett described having a dream where Pan showed him the movements of the cosmos, like the inner workings of the universe.
Basically, it's a chapter on drugs.
Whatever the truth is about The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, we're still talking about it today, whether through my film, Wild Swimmers, right through to debates around its sexual or religious origins. The Piper at the Gates is still calling.